This podcast is for teachers and educators that want to better understand what racial equity is, get strategies on how to create a culturally responsive learning environment, and learn how racial equity improves outcomes for students, particularly students of color.
Welcome to our Affirming Racial Equity podcast. We will be discussing today a tool that teachers can use while they are planning. And with us today is the whole DEP RT team. Woo woo! So, with us, we have Donna Lawson. She is high school. We have Katia Turner, Zone 1, Durful. We have Lamanda Moore Rodriguez, Zone 3. We have Rachel Klein, Middle School. We have Kanita Ballard, AIS Support. And then Shashre McCormack, Zone 2.
Okay, this tool that we're sharing with teachers to use in their PLCs is nicknamed the R tool for Affirming Racial Equity. And the first section is called Content Integration. When we think about integrating content to affirm racial equity, we want to make sure that we're using examples from a variety of cultural groups. And then, as you look at the tool, we have some lesson descriptors for you to think about. Are you including viewpoints of diverse cultures? Do your materials and resources reflect identities and experiences of students? Is your content validating to underrepresented people? And then does your curriculum allow students to look into others' experiences as well as opportunities to see themselves in the curriculum? So when we think about integrating content and disrupting the curriculum, we look at the text that we already have and see how they align with these descriptors. An example from a second grade curriculum framework might be the book Bringing the Rain to Kapiti Plain. While this does fit in to the curriculum and it has representation of characters from a part of Africa, when we look at the descriptors, it doesn't completely align. And so as we're planning, we want to think about, well, how can we avoid the stereotype of people in Africa that are, farming and poor, which is what our students believe all of Africa is. Then we could bring in some other texts like Africa is not a country. We could use the example of Black Panther and talk about Afrofuturism, where students see Africa in another light, showing the intelligence, the possibility, the creativity, and then that is validating to our students, and in that way affirms racial equity.
And this is Kanita, and I think also just coming from a literacy standpoint, that seeing yourself across different genres really leans on the ability to critically think and multimodality, to be able to see oneself in the context of, oh, this is fantasy, this is sci-fi. How does the genre engage and interact with the culture at play? And what are some of the unique things that can arise when those two elements are combined? Like, you are able to bring out different nuances of the culture, again, when you're seeing it across genres. One additional element of the art tool is about knowledge construction. This is where teachers help students understand how bias and culture create and influence knowledge. Now, this tends to be a very nuanced layer of the equitable classroom that many teachers struggle with because it entails breaking down what is considered by many to be abstract concepts like privilege. And so many teachers tend to actually use that as a barrier to not teach our students. However, this is by and large a misconception, because there's nothing more dangerous than living in a state of unaware when that state doesn't care one bit about what one does know or doesn't know. It's still going to act upon the individual. So we can engage our students in awareness by analyzing and building their knowledge of the world around them. And this entails, as our tool notes, providing context to the history of the privilege and oppression, engaging students to recognize and critiquing power relationships, helping students develop inquiry, analysis, critical thinking, creative writing, etc., and having a curriculum that allows students to position themselves contextually within the content, and also having values, assumptions, and word choices being evaluated and eliminated by students when appropriate, having students being invited to the process of assessing and discussing values, assumptions, and word choices, and then ultimately having a unit, having an instructional space that allows students to examine, research, and question information and sources. And again, really, when teachers think about equity and an equitable classroom, they are aware of the soft skills, quote unquote, that go into that space that needs to be created. But it's not that equity only exists within the context of soft skills like empathy. Equity in an equitable classroom is a hard and soft skill, and that's something that the art tool really highlights with language like, again, students are engaging in written and oral communication. They are engaging in literacy texts, they are involved in quantitative texts, they are involved in research skills.
So, Kenita, I just wanted to connect what we talked about earlier with content integration. So exactly, knowledge construction makes that connection, because if you're reading a text like Bringing the Rain from Kapiti Plain, which is considered to be part of the classics, students can ask that question, why is it part of the classics? Where did this text come from? And then use those research skills to find out that, to ask when they're asking the question, is this really an African folktale? What people did it come from? And then they'll learn that this really is an African folktale, but it has been retold through a European lens. And then it's been made to fit the pattern of European nursery rhymes. And then we go on to understanding how stereotypes are developed and continue to build students' knowledge of themselves and how our society has come to believe what they believe about different groups of people.
And that is a great segue into Prejudice Elimination, which is another part of the art tool. And teachers, you must understand, this is like, you won't be able to do every last one of these, but it's very important that you spend some time finding a focus to start off with, so that as you're planning, you're able to look at every single part of this Affirming Racial Equity tool. So prejudice elimination is important because we don't want prejudice reduction, we want prejudice elimination. Teachers intentionally planning their lessons to build understanding and foster intergroup relationships. So one of the questions you really want to be able to ask yourself in your classroom is, what climate do you want in your classroom and in your school? So one of the equitable lesson descriptors is the unit or lesson helps students unpack bias and stereotypes. So as we think about the book, Bringing the Rain to is it from Kapiti Plain? To Kapiti Plain, that students assume that that Africa is just first of all, they think it is a country and not a continent, and that it's a desolate place. People don't wear shoes, they don't have food, and not knowing that that is not all of Africa, because there are places in Africa where it snows. There are resources where there's a site for Everyday Africa, so kids can see that African countries have places that are bigger and better than New York City right here in the United States. So students need the kind of language as we talk about bias and stereotypes, because you just can't use the term bias and stereotypes and not explain to them what it means. So you have to provide context and words and post them in your classrooms and refer back to them so students can understand what the term bias is and what stereotypes are, and how that book kind of perpetuates bias and stereotypes that have been taught to them throughout, their time in school. So this work starts early. You have to discuss why some words hurt, building on historical, psychological, and aspects, and help students to understand their power to hurt. As we think about incidents that have happened right here in JCPS around watermelon incidents and incidents with hijabs and incidents with hair, we have to talk about why there's a problem and why students feel our marginalized students are feeling sad being in different spaces within JCPS. So also your lesson must portray minoritized groups in a range that is not traditional. And what that means is that you have to, as we think about minority, that is a term that we want to be very careful about. Students who are facing these social, educational, economical, environmental barriers, sometimes lessons constrict them and put them in this box. So the traditional ways of talking about food and garb and ethnic tradition has to be, that's surface level. We have to be able to have conversations with kids about what's happening like right now. And also to move quickly, that building cultural humility is very important. It's a philosophy, not an approach. It is something that needs to be talked about constantly in your classroom. It's about being able to listen and hear and see the humanity of your students. And they're just not here for you to just impart all of this knowledge on them. They have their own funds of knowledge as well that they bring into the classroom.
So this is LaManda. And so just following my colleagues, the next part on our tool is about equitable pedagogy. So it talks about how teachers modify strategies, resources, and methods to facilitate academic achievement of underrepresented societal groups. So this is really important because when we think about pedagogy in JCPS, this is an area that wholly needs some improvement. When we think about the things that we teach, we know that it comes from a European lens. And in this case, we want to think about how we can incorporate more about our students into just the lessons of what we teach. So some of the equitable lesson descriptors here include utilize a variety of instructional methods to match students' learning preferences, to maintain students' attention, and increase student interest in learning. So that is nothing foreign to teachers. We know that there are a variety of instructional methods that could be used with our students. However, when it comes time to planning and thinking about how we incorporate those into our classrooms for our students, that often lacks. And I know that it may be something that teachers might struggle with how to get all of these in, but we know that different learning styles are important to our students because that's how they access the information. So if we don't plan with these things in mind, we're not thinking about how we're losing our students and their interests. So if you think about a student that is a visual learner, it can just be adding a strategy that says, hey, close your eyes. I want to tell you a story. I want you to picture this in your mind. And where that may, to some teachers, that may sound like not a big deal, but in other classrooms, this could be something that is a brand new concept, and it's not anything that's outlandish. It's just about bringing in what our students need. So how are we going to speak to those students' different learning styles so that they can grasp the material? Otherwise, they might not have been able to. And so looking forward, we want to think about another lesson descriptor, and it's developing a repertoire of instructional examples that are culturally familiar to students to serve as a scaffold for learning. So this is where teachers are going to have to also be on their P's and Q's. If you have kids, you are listening to what they're saying. You're watching what they're watching. If you have Twitter, you're on Twitter and you're seeing, all of the relevant issues that are coming up today. Mm-hmm. So when you are tuned in and you're dialed in like that, it would be easier to pull some examples out of the air that your students could connect to. So if maybe you're on Twitter and you're hearing all of this about the Popeyes chicken sandwich, well, how can you connect the Popeyes chicken sandwich to something that's going on in your classroom? Because your students are going to pick that up. How can you pull in talking about things like, I forgot, natural connections. Ooh, hold on, we might need to pause that out. But just knowing that you are a willing researcher and trying to get familiar with the things that your students like, the things that are going on in their culture, because we're going to have to be able to use that as a connection in learning. And if we think about scaffolding is a strategy that is temporary. So helping our students to access that information, we want to make sure that they have something to hold on to make a connection to something in their world.
So I just wanted to add to what you were saying, Lamanda, for my technology challenged friends like myself. A good way to research things that are happening in pop culture is to go to your search on your Twitter and then go across to like entertainment, fun, sports, trending. Those are things that our kids are talking about that we can make connections to their knowledge base to help them understand.
Yes, teachers must be willing to learn all the time. And I think a lot of times it's difficult because it's hard to see someone else's culture when you benefit from great privilege. So it's important that you check yourself daily, because just because that may not be important to you, it could be important to your students. So you need to be willing to bring that into your classroom and have discussion around that.
Another thing that we can talk about is creating a community of learners and encouraging students to focus on collective work, responsibility, and cooperation, which if you hear that, then your ear should be ringing, because there is a backpack of success skill which directly correlates with that. We want to make sure that our students know how to collaborate in a productive way and have those conversations to where in the classroom they're building that trust amongst their classmates. It's making the classroom an optimal place for learning. They're with their peers. So if we know that that's something that is a backpack skill, then that is something that is absolutely needed in our classroom as well. And it's not uncommon for us to walk into a classroom and seeing all our students sitting in rows and in desks where they're not set up for a collaborative environment. And that absolutely does show in the after effects of those students learning. If they're sitting and they're alone all day, they're not talking to anyone, they're not having the opportunity to bounce ideas off of a partner or explain their learning to a partner, then we're losing a lot of opportunities there for our students to learn. And then something a colleague said earlier, I think it was Kanita, we were talking about holding high expectations and providing the same rigorous content modified through scaffolds. So this tool has a lot of great things to help teachers to think about their pedagogy. How do they acquire that academic language to be able to perform class tasks? Well, that's going to help with those culturally responsive examples that you've learned from combing Twitter, from reading professional books, listening to podcasts. Those are all going to come out in your scaffolds because you know your students and some of the things that are going on in their world. And then lastly, just present students with real world situations that address societal issues, not excluding controversial topics. Not. So we can't let these opportunities for discussion and debate and we just can't let these opportunities go by. The world is really is a different place right now. But if we think about opportunities to have conversations where it could lift up students, like just think about how can we connect some of the things you're doing in your classroom. This year there was a lot of things that happened. Jay-Z is working with the NFL. Beyonce's Homecoming documentary came out. Nipsey Hussle passed away. That's something that if you're a teacher, these are things that your kids are talking about, the Little Mermaid debate. If these are things that are going on in the world that your students are talking about, why not jump in and be a part of the conversation so that you can guide some of that learning? And so lastly, before I go, I just want to just share a quote from Bell Hooks, and she says, critically intervene in a way that challenges and changes.
Well, as Lamanda kind of segued into, an important section that we need to talk about is empowering classroom culture. And we've talked about the importance of students seeing themselves and specifically eliminating prejudice. But as teachers, we need to empower our classroom culture by starting with recognizing and affirming the value of race. We have to profoundly change our awareness and beliefs and values regarding race. As Shashre mentioned, students of color are not empty vessels to be filled with knowledge, and their experiences are not deficient or less than. They come to school with rich backgrounds and experiences and knowledge. They're beautifully different from most teachers, or a lot of the teachers that they have in Jefferson County. Student teachers need to know and feel that they're valuable and they're powerful and they're vitally needed in your classroom. and that without them and their knowledge and their background and their contributions, that literally your class would suffer. It would not be the same. We've talked about the importance of student voice and critical thinking and conversations, but before we do this, it's important that we as teachers have strategies for critical conversations with students. And we recently learned of a teaching tolerance publication that's called Let's Talk that is full of strategies to help you facilitate critical conversations, including how to prepare yourself and a step-by-step plan for students. Also, please don't forget to look critically in your classroom, literally stand in it, and then say, how does your classroom environment and your procedures, your systems, and your instruction overvalue some students and devalue other students? So how are your classroom, or how is your systems and your processes in your classroom viewed by Black students, or your Latinx students, or your English as second language students? Do they see themselves in the visual displays? Are they in the discussions? Are they in the curriculum? Because our classrooms need to be welcoming and positive and supporting, especially for our students of color. And we have to know about our students to do this. So a surefire way to do that is to communicate with parents. Please don't assume that parents are not interested or they do not want to be or cannot be a part of the dialogue. Assume good intentions and view them as partners. Reach out to parents and utilize the skill set, community contacts, and information they bring to the table, and include their wisdom, family wisdom and community wisdom in the student learning whenever you can. Because when students of color see themselves in these ways, they start to contextualize their learning and personalize it, and they learn more efficiently and deeply. To learn more about a lot of these concepts, you can attend our mobile summit sessions coming up.
All right, this is Rachel, and the section I'd like to share with you all from our R tool is Affirming Racial Equity Through Assessment. And I think a lot of people, when they're trying to reframe their pedagogy and their decisions and their instructional choices, assessment may not be at the forefront of their mind, but it's certainly something that we must consider if we're going to do this and do it right. So assessment is a leverageable tool for providing equity in our instructional practices. The landscape of teaching and learning is changing, and assessment definitely needs to keep up. No longer should fill in the bubble or multiple choice or essay tests be the pinnacle of assessment methods. They're a few out of many, but they rarely obtain true measures of mastery for all students when they're used as the only method. We've got to reconsider how we assess students, and this starts with the students themselves. We must include them in conversations about the assessment long before it is given. Researchers Montenegro and Jankowski say that being student-focused calls for student involvement through the entire assessment process, including the development of student learning outcomes, the selection of assessment tools, the development process, data collection, interpretation, and use of results. Beginning with the assessment in mind keeps all parties apprised of the end goal, fosters more meaningful learning experiences along the way, and lends itself more naturally to the feedback loop. Set a goal, create a product, receive feedback, and make adjustments until mastery is achieved. Let's consider the direction that JCPS is heading in terms of assessment by looking at the backpack of skills, a plan that Chief Academic Officer Carmen Coleman has helped to spearhead. The Backpack Initiative values more than just test scores in a student's academic journey. Coleman says that test scores are one piece of the puzzle to determine student success, but she says so much more goes into making kids truly prepared for the next level. Rather than just be successful academically, she says, we are making a much broader definition of success. By giving credence and attention to capacities like innovation, communication, resilience, and cultural competence, we are telling students that they are much more than a singular test score. We are telling them that we value their contributions, their cultures, their growth mindsets, and their experiences. By doing so, we are also preparing them for a changing world that demands innovation, requires the ability to navigate differences, and commends collaborative efforts. This means that our assessments must reflect these changes. Here's one example of a way to build equitable assessment into your practices this year. Begin a new unit by first informing students of the specific standards and learning targets that are critical to master by the end of the unit. Then work with students to create an assessment rubric that reflects those standards and add in any other performance criteria such as a particular backpack skill, social justice standard from the Teaching Tolerance website, or a critical practice for anti-bias instruction, which is also found on the Teaching Tolerance website. Determine together what levels of performance indicate mastery, and then begin working with students to design an assessment menu. Collect student input regarding what kinds of products they would enjoy creating to demonstrate mastery, and involve students in the discussion of what each product should contain in order to demonstrate mastery. From this point, you can create a master assessment document that contains a copy of the group-generated rubric, a list of product choices, and the requirements for all products. Share this with your students to make sure that their input has been reflected by the menu, tweak it if necessary, and then provide a copy for all students. At this point, you can begin with instruction, as all members of the learning community are clear as to the direction they're all heading in. It is vital to be aware that even assessments can shut a student out of the learning process, especially if they're not aligned to the content, which also needs to be culturally relevant. Again, Montenegro and Jankowski believe that assessment approaches and processes can help reinforce a sense of belonging or add to the student's belief that they do not belong because their learning or experiences are not deemed as valid or important. In other words, why try when even an assessment makes it clear that your culture and experiences aren't valued? So as you're heading into this year with renewed energy, focus, and passion for your students, remember that classroom experiences can spell continued success or repeated failures for our students. You have the power and responsibility to make changes that make it possible for all of our students to come out on the winning end.
Thank you for listening to today's podcast. It is our hope that this tool will be utilized in the classroom because we're all here for our students and we're all here to affirm racial equity.